My paper is on emission control efforts in Germany and its associated effects on productivity. This presentation is broken down into three sections. 1. Introduction and thesis. 2. Counter-arguments and refutals. 3. The conclusion. Starting with the introduction, we'll go through the core issue, the seriousness of the issue, and the implications associated with emission control. Then, we'll state the thesis and proceed to the counter-arguments and the conclusions. Climate change is one of the most prominent issues faced today. Recently, there has been widespread efforts to alleviate climate change. Much of these efforts are centered around emission control policies. Germany is no exception to this and has its fair share of regulations aimed at emission control towards the alleviation of global warming. However, emission-friendly production methods are often more expensive, less accessible, less efficient, and therefore less profitable than emission-heavy ones. It becomes paramount for policymakers to not only consider the effectiveness of emission control regulations, but to also factor in its financial feasibility. Ideally, it should be implemented in a way that is not detrimental to productivity and, by extension, the economy. Emissions is a core contributor to air pollution, which has been linked to bad health and environmental degradation. A keystone consideration in the alleviation of global warming is therefore emission control, and is a strong focus by the German government and the dedicated organization, the UBA, which is Germany's central environmental authority. The thesis for this paper is that the migration towards sustainable production methods by Germany are effective and necessary. Now we will move on to some common counterarguments against climate change and, by extension, emission controls. Despite global warming and the need for emission controls being widely accepted today, there are still many counterarguments to emission control regulations and global warming as a whole. Mainly, counterarguments claim that there is insufficient empirical evidence to support that human activity has any bearing on climate change, and as a result, policies and emission control efforts are futile. To support this, evidence is gathered to show that climate change is a natural and inevitable process. Others question the validity of the evidence that is there in support of climate change, stating that the data has been collected over a very short period of time relative to the age of the Earth, and therefore does not paint a clear picture of the Earth's natural cycles. Other critics adopt an economic standpoint, proposing climate change benefits only richer countries and perpetuates inequality or compromises productivity altogether. Now we will move on to refuting these counterclaims. Most of these counterclaims suffer from two main weak points. One is being obsolete, as they were often made in the late 90s before a lot of evidence that we use today was collected. Another flaw is making key omissions by not painting the full picture. While climate change is a natural process, there is much evidence to suggest that human activity does affect atmospheric compositions and, by extension, global warming. Additionally, studies carried out in Germany in the marine, transportation, and heating industries conclude that emission control regulations have made impacts in atmospheric conditions. The UBA data indicates that by 2030, emission regulations would have reduced emissions 55% relative to the 1990 benchmark, and by 2055, emissions would be extremely low. Their publishings and data endorses the effectiveness of emission control regulations. As for the effects on productivity, despite having strict emission control policies in a number of industries, Germany has still managed to see respectable economic growth since their implementation. This is evidence that these policies do not deteriorate productivity to the detriment of the economy, as the counterclaims often argue. Additionally, as sustainable production methods become perfected, the cost of implementation will lower and the accessibility of it will rise. This brings us to the conclusion. Conclusively, there is evidence to suggest that while emission control policies and practices do pose their challenges, they are both effective and financially feasible without being detrimental to productivity. It would be wise for Germany to continue to facilitate the UBA in their emission control efforts with specific focus on the commercial freight, land, and marine vessels in order to attain their 55% emission reduction target by 2030. Additionally, educational campaigns and further recognition of the UBA's achievements would go a long way in swaying public opinion into seeing emission controls as more of a benefit than a burden.